Welcome to another episode of Coffee Spills and Pineapples. My guest today is Juliana, a traveling storyteller from Colombia. Hi, Juliana. How are you?
Great to meet you.
Thank you for making the time and accepting our invitation. I know that your time is quite tight and you're traveling to the next country. Tell us how did you start this traveling idea that you need to travel and you need to tell stories, but not only tell the stories, but to actually travel and do it in different places that you've either been or not been at all?
I've always loved stories. I never knew that storytelling was a profession, that it was something that you could study, that people made a living out of. And when I discovered that there was a storytelling school in my city, Medellin of Colombia, I thought, how did I not know about this beforehand? This is what I want to do with my life. So I signed up for that. But then in the third semester, a friend of mine was doing a trip through Central America, and she asked if I wanted to join her. Now, I've always loved travel. A lot of people do. That's not something strange.
True. Here, me.
But also, I prefer traveling with good company than alone. I also like traveling alone. It has its own magic. But when she said, do you want to come with me? I'm thinking of hitchhiking through Central America back to Colombia. I was like, yeah, let's do it. We were broke students. I was taking a semester off from the storytelling school. I said, well, we don't need too much money. The road will provide. And what we would do was that she would make paintings to sell, and I would tell stories.
Wow.
I would come up to random strangers sitting in a park and say, with a colorful dress, a great big smile, and say, I've come all the way from Colombia to tell you a story. Would you like to hear it? And Latin Americans are very open and friendly. Most people would say yes, and most people would give a tip, and that was how we paid our way. And it was a magical experience, and I got bitten by the travel bug, as you said.
I must say that that's a courageous thing to do, to actually tackle this road trip, not knowing what to expect and hoping that people will be generous enough to help you, I guess, live and eat and travel to the next place and discover. I'm glad it worked out well. I assume that that's why you probably thought about continuing on traveling, or did you take a pause after that?
I went back and finished the storytelling studies.
Right.
And when I graduated, I had the opportunity. I happened to be in the United States for something, and I said, well, I need to go see the big storytelling festival because I was relatively close by and it was around the right dates. And I traveled to Utah. I saw this huge storytelling festival called Timpanodos, and everything I saw there was so completely different than the 3 years that I had just spent studying storytelling in Colombia.
What do you mean? Like different in what sense?
Different in so many different senses. For instance, in the United States, storytelling is more for families, and there's a lot of storytelling for children, and the focus is more to educate and to entertain. Most people tell folk tales.
Right.
And the background of the people telling stories are often retired teachers or librarians or
Right.
ministers, and it's often with some sort of fun, friendly,
Yes.
positive purpose. In Colombia, nobody tells stories for children. Storytelling is very intense. It's often very dark.
Wow.
Storytelling in Colombia, you find it on the streets or in public universities because it rose up as a kind of counter-revolution. Colombia and Latin America in general has gone through a lot of turmoil and oppression from different factors, not even so much from the government, but from different actors. And when a people are living under oppression, you have to find other ways to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And so art is the way to say the things you cannot say. That has always been its purpose.
That's right.
And so storytelling in Colombia has mostly been the realm of the young and the angry, the ones who are trying to call out, to denounce the things that are going on in society, to wake people up, to shake them up, to challenge some sort of very strong emotional reaction so that people will do something.
Get off their asses, basically.
In Colombia as well, the people who do storytelling generally have a background in theater or stand-up comedy. And like with stand-up comedy, when it's really good, it's really good.
Right.
When it's really bad, it's really
Right.
bad.
I see. So, I mean, you can't pretend, is what you're saying. Like, you can't pretend to be doing the storytelling in the format that you're talking about. So my experience with storytelling was my dad always telling us a story at night or whenever he was able to, so weekends or whenever we went on outings. And his stories, I remember, always had the king with the three daughters or the three sons or the three, wise savants who were going on this trip, and the first said, and then the second did, and the third didn't, or whatever. And there was always like, one of the three always did the things right, and he was the one that got, the princess, the treasure, the youngest, because the oldest is not wise enough to take to get the treasure at the end of the stick. That was my experience with stories. And when you said in Utah, the storytelling process was mostly fairy tales, talking about, children's stories and telling stories for children and the school, the librarian. I think that was in Canada and even before that, in Kuwait, where I grew up. That would be the kind of storytelling that I would be familiar with. Of course, I was a child and I wouldn't know the difference. I know that there's a lot of women groups, and I think in Arabic the word shirkat, yeah? So they would come together for coffee and they would talk about things. So gossiping, I would say, is another form of storytelling. But through gossiping, they would learn about the ongoings of, politics, economy, the society, and the changes, and so on. I think that's a very interesting perception on people's behalf of how to use story to get their ideas across, and not just to children, but really more for adult to adult conversations. So having finished your university and having had the bug to travel, so you went to the States and then came back, or did you continue from there on?
I continued from there. I realized that there was so much more to learn, and so I set off on a solo trip for about a year with the specific intention to learn about storytelling in other cultures. And the easiest to access were North America and Europe because of the language and all that. Right. So I went to different festivals and workshops in several different countries, mostly throughout Europe, connect with storytellers wherever I could. I performed in some places as well, and I would pay for the trip by telling stories along the way. Mm-hmm. Now, telling stories on the street didn't work in Europe like it does in Latin America.
Why not? Like, what's the difference?
There are cultural differences. For one, language barrier, of course, is a big thing. But even in countries like Spain or the UK, where language was not a problem, the culture was. Because whereas in Latin America, when you see somebody with a colorful dress, you're curious about them. You know they're not from around here. You want to know what's going on. I've realized that in more developed, safer countries, almost the safer a country is, the more afraid people are. Mm. They see somebody different, and very often, instead of curiosity, it's suspicion that
That's
people
an interesting correlation, though. This is the safer the country, the more afraid people are.
It's been my experience, or at least afraid of the other, right? Yeah. Afraid of the unfamiliar. Perhaps because in more dangerous countries, you're more used to recognizing the signs of danger, and you know how to handle yourself, and you know what to do if things go wrong. Mm-hmm. But if you've never had the experience, then you're more afraid because you don't have the tools to cope. But this is just a theory. I don't know.
No, I'm thinking about the analogy. Is it more about safety, or is it more about the global north that has created this notion of the other being unsafe? Because I think there are many safe countries, not necessarily in Europe, that are quite safe, and I think the relation human to human would be quite different. Mm-hmm. And I think my perception of this whole post-colonial approach on how we see this Orientalism concept of looking at the other through your cultural norms and understanding they're not the same, thus creating this differentiation between us and being afraid of that thing that I don't know. So yeah, that's an interesting a notion maybe to explore in the coming maybe years as you keep traveling and discovering perhaps safer countries that are not necessarily European.
Yeah, of course.
But I wanted to ask, why do you tell stories? Why storytelling? What does it do to you, and what does it do to the listener?
It's not about the money, because storytellers are always broke. Which means that we're doing something wrong, right? I mean, I do think that we need to learn to adapt and feed the hunger and find what it is that people are craving for, because it's not right. If somebody is completely struggling financially, if their art is, the whole concept of starving artist, I mean, look at artists who make millions and millions, right? So it's not that people are not willing to pay for art. It's that, well, whatever we're doing is getting us the results that we're getting. So it's something that I'm working on and exploring, because I don't want to stay in the, to use the new age, scarcity mindset forever. But it does feel like a calling. I've always loved stories. Even as a child, almost before I learned how to speak, I was always making stories of my dolls and out of clay and drawing and whatnot, and reading books, wishing that there were some kind of story-based profession I could work towards. I always thought I would be a writer ever since I was little, because that was the only way I knew of working with stories. But writing is very lonely, and I'm very much of a people person. So what do you
Filmmaking, I mean, these are all forms of telling stories.
Of course, of course. I would say that the forms telling stories that I've chosen is, and the reason I like it so much is because it's right here, right now, and it's being built together. There can still be a movie without anybody to watch it. There can't be a story without a listener. So with the same with a book. You can write a book and you can be writing for yourself, and maybe you don't care if anybody ever reads that book. Or maybe somebody reads the book and they have no direct connection to you at all. But storytelling is here and now. I am me, you are you, and I'm telling you a story, but you're building it with your imagination. And so we're kind of building the story together, because I'm watching your reactions and I'm making changes to the story as I tell it, depending on who's listening and how it's landing.
Can you tell me and maybe our listeners a story?
Of course, I'd be happy to. Thank you for asking. I say creek, you say crack. Creek.
Crack.
Creek.
Crack.
This is a Colombian story. It's a story that I love to tell, and it begins at the very beginning of time, when the world was brand new. Back then, the most beautiful woman who ever walked the face of the earth walked the face of the earth. Her name was Marina, and she was so beautiful because her body was made entirely out of water. Water is life, water is precious, and everybody loved Marina. But the one who loved her the most was Marino. Marino was a strong, handsome young man whose body was made entirely out of salt. And they could not have been more opposite, but they do say that opposites attract, and Marina and Marino wanted to be together forever. But there was a problem. Usually are in love stories, aren't there?
There's always a problem.
This problem was the sun. The sun wanted Marina for himself, and he couldn't understand why she had chosen Marino. What did she see in him? He was just salt, but he was the sun. He was so powerful. He was so hot. Well, he decided that he knew best, and Marina would thank him later, and he started making plans to kidnap Marina and take her by force to his realm in the sky. But Marina found out, and she and Marino held hands and ran all night to hide from the sun. Marina knew the entrance to the deepest, darkest caves where the sun would never be able to find them. But salt can't run as fast as water can. And even though Marino tried desperately to keep up, and Marina certainly wasn't going to leave her beloved behind, by the time the sun rose, they had not made it to the caves in time.
Oh, no.
They were trapped in the worst possible place, a vast, expansive plain that stretched from horizon to horizon without even a shadow to hide under. And the sun saw them immediately and started reaching for Marina. But Marino held on to her so tightly that their bodies became one. One vast body of water mixed with salt that filled the entire plain, stretching from horizon to horizon. And that is why we have the sea. Marina and Marino were together. And their love, they were so joyful that they were together, that new life sprang up from within them. And that is why we have dolphins and fish and whales, singing whales. Oh, the bountiful life of the ocean. But the sun was not going to give up so easily. And he began to heat and pull on Marina. And Marina started feeling her body becoming lighter and lighter and rising up into the sky. She tried to hold on to Marino. Marina tried to hold on to her. But the sun was too powerful. And Marina was ripped away from the one she loved, from her home, from everything she knew. But just as she was about to be devoured by the sun's blazing heat, the enemy of the sun saw what was happening. Now, who do you say is the enemy of the sun?
Enemy of the sun.
The one who's
The
always
cloud?
very good at
Oh, yes.
actually. But because the clouds cover the sun's face, right?
Yeah.
Even when it's the time for the sun to be shining. But if you think about it, and if you look at folklore and mythology and everywhere around the world, the clouds are just floating lazily along. Who is the one who blows the clouds in front of the sun's face? The wind. Yes. And whether it's Aesop's fables or Japanese mythology or wherever, the wind and the sun have always been mortal enemies. And when the wind saw that the sun was about to obtain what he most desired, out of pure spite, he decided to take it away. And so the wind began to blow with all the force of a hurricane and of a gale, and Marina was blown back and forth. The sun squeezed her tightly to not let go, but he squeezed her so hard that her body broke into a million tiny little droplets that slipped through his fingers and fell until she was dashed to pieces against the rocks of the highest mountains. She was completely and utterly destroyed. And yet, she did not die, because her love was so strong that even though she had been broken into a million tiny little droplets, every single broken piece of her body was a drop of fresh rain. And wherever she fell, she was so full of love and life that new life sprang up. And that is why we have forests and flowers and fruit trees. And even though she had been scattered to the farthest reaches of the earth, every single piece of her still remembered the way back home. And she started to find the way down, dropping, jumping
To Marino.
rock,
Yeah?
all the way down, turning into streams and then rivers to Marino,
Yes.
where he was waiting for her with open arms. They were together again. And they were safe until the next day when the sun rose again. And once again, the sun heated, and once again, the wind blew, and once again, Marina was dashed against the rocks. And so it continues to this day. And yet, no matter how many times Marina is broken into pieces, she always puts herself back together, and she always finds her way back home. And that's why to this day, by the side of the sea, the sun always burns so bright. That's also why to this day, why up in the mountains, the wind always blows so hard. And that's also why to this day, when we, the children of Marina and Marino, whenever we cry, whether it's out of sadness or joy, the tears that come from deep inside of us are a mixture, so that we will always remember that we are made of water, salt, and so much love.
That was beautiful. Really, it was fantastic. I didn't expect it to finish with me, the human. I just thought it would be about the ocean and Marina and Marino and the sun and the clouds. And I didn't realize that you'll end it with the human. Love was an underlying theme for me from the beginning. And I think it sort of culminated with that. So we're made of water, salt, and love. That was beautiful. Thank you so much. I am pretty sure that all of us were just, you had us hanging on a cliff, and we just wanted to hear the next word that comes out of your mouth. Let me just absorb this a little bit. You said it's a Colombian story?
It is a Colombian
And is
story.
something recent or something you'd heard a while ago? How does this evolve?
So I love this story in particular because it's so hard to find Colombian stories or even Latin American stories in general. Whereas Armenia, for instance, or so many countries have a rich oral tradition going back sometimes thousands of years. Colombia is a new country. We're a mixture of people from Africa, multiple indigenous groups, different Europeans who came in and conquered the land 500 years ago. So we're a people with not the kind of roots that many other nations have, because we as Colombians, we don't grow up hearing Colombian stories. We grew up with Greek mythology and the Brothers Grimm.
Nice.
We don't know much about the indigenous people who were there before, even.
So it didn't exist, or you don't know? Because there's a difference there, right? So it doesn't exist, or because you said we grew up with stories that are not Colombian.
Mm-hmm.
But do Colombian stories exist?
Of course.
Yes.
Of course. But see, the thing is, the concept of Colombia is only about 200 years old. Mm-hmm. Before that, I mean, there's still 86 languages at least that are spoken in Colombia by indigenous peoples, but some of these languages are only spoken by 10 people. It's and most Colombians, like I say, we're a mixture. We don't have this connection to the land that the indigenous people did and do. And so that's why when I heard this story, it's a very popular story among storytelling circles in Colombia, I thought, aha, finally I have a Colombian story that I really like and I want to tell. I always try to research stories as best as possible and learn about the culture they come from. And I'd heard different versions. Some storytellers said that it came from the Caribe people of the Caribbean coast. Others that it was of the Waju nation of the desert peninsula in the north, the ones who make these beautiful woven bags, for instance. So I asked my storytelling teacher if he knew exactly where this story came from. And he said, oh, yes, I wrote it. Wow. So upset because I really wanted it to be an ancient story.
Yeah, and this one coming from centuries, maybe. Hopefully.
Of course, that has survived the passage of time and war. But really, later on, I felt, you know what, this is perfect. Because when your stories are taken from you, or when you're thrown into the world without something to hold on to, without stories, the greatest act of rebellion is to go out and make your own.
Yeah. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the creative process, right? I think you hit on the nail when you said why stories are created in this purpose, because there's an amalgamation of reasons why stories would be created, for what purpose. For instance, I remember, in the olden Anatolian years, we would have the Hakawati, the storyteller, using puppets, the karagas and whatnot. And then there would be the troubadours who would go from village to village, singing stories, telling the news through song. And early 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s, we had some Armenian, I would say, scholars, priests, musicians, put all these stories, oral stories, on paper. And that's why I think we have these stories through generations come down to us today in the 21st century. And we either tell them as they are or retell them the way we see them today, because the world has changed, and those stories, in order to survive, would need to be modernized so that my son would hear about that story, but with reference points that he can make. So yeah, the creative process. I'm glad that you brought that up and you told us about how your professor wrote and created a story. Have you created a story? Have you had the chance to build a story of your own? Have you gone through that process yet? Maybe.
A little bit, but it's not my main focus.
I see.
As a storyteller, I generally collect stories from oral tradition, mythology, folklore, and in Latin America specifically, people tell mostly literature. There is a very, very rich treasure of literature in Latin America, specifically when it comes to magical realism. And what many Latin American storytellers do is that they take some of these stories and sometimes mix them,
weave them,
weave them together with older things or with personal experiences, or make things up.
Do you do that? Do you mix your own? Yeah.
Yeah. Often when I'll give a full storytelling show, which is like an hour and a half long, then between the stories that I tell, I weave in some of my own personal experiences to
make it yours.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the basis will be like literature stories or stories you've heard and you retell, and then you add different things to spice it up and make it more personal. In terms of creating, we talked a little bit about process of being inspired. I think we've spoken of this studio time about how there were episodes where you had a momentary, I guess, or temporary situation that I want you to tell us about. And I guess that would be a turning point for you of some sort, without keeping the audience in suspense. Can you tell us about that episode? What happened? What did you do? And how did you salvage that?
Are you talking about when I lost my story?
Yes, that's the thing I'm talking about.
Okay.
Tell us how would someone lose their stories?
I think it has happened to most of us at some point in which we lose a part of ourselves. And there are so many different ways to describe this. For instance, ever since my son died, a part of me died too. Or I haven't been quite the same since the accident. Or the child used to love drawing, but after the abuse, she never drew.
These are traumas, right? We're talking about traumatic incidents where you have your life before and after that episode. Is that something that's related to the loss, or?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, okay.
It can also happen gradually, though. I mean, it can be if you're, say, in a job that you hate and every day you dread it, and every day it's like you lose a piece of it, piece of yourself every day that you go, until suddenly you realize you don't recognize who you are anymore. And those are, I think that is trauma as well. Trauma is a wound in some way or another. That was what happened to me. Stories were such a fundamental part of my identity. I was the traveling storyteller. That was who I was, and I felt it was my soul's purpose, my calling, right? And after something that was very painful for me, I discovered that I couldn't tell stories anymore.
Wow.
That when I tried, it was like I was vomiting dead words. It didn't make my face light up. It didn't fill me with energy, and I felt there was no
feeling, right?
I dreaded it. It was terrible. I tried to force myself for several months at first, because I threw myself wholeheartedly into storytelling. My intention was to be, okay, I'm going to become a professional storyteller. I'm going to live off of this. This will be everything. But finally, I realized it's a disrespect to the stories and to myself. The audience may not be able to tell the difference, but I'm not here.
Did you
Speak
stop?
to me. I did.
Okay.
I did, because I realized it was just hurting myself, and I was dreading it. And eventually I was going to hate it. And you shouldn't do that.
No, you shouldn't.
I said, okay, I'll do something else for now. I'm just depressed for now. I'm sad for now. It'll pass. The stories will come back.
You could have become, I mean, you're still a storyteller now, and that's why, you're here and we're talking about storytelling. So something did happen and you didn't end up being a banker, right? So I think the magic for us, the audience, the listener, to hear your story and how did that happen? How you lost this love and the passion for something that you grew up with, as you said. So how did you find it? What did you do? Because I think that's the lesson that we're going to take from you today is, to be resilient and go and bring it back.
Like Marina, to put
Like
yourself back together.
Marina, right? Yes.
So at first I did nothing because I just thought, okay, it'll be back any moment. When it was something that was such a big part of me, it didn't even occur to me that I could no longer be a storyteller, that wasn't me anymore. And so I just waited and expected things to get better and for the stories to come back. What I mean is, it might sound strange to say that the stories can speak to me, but that was what it felt like when I was traveling through Mexico, through Central America, for instance, when just suddenly a story would pop into my head. And I would tell that story to the person there sitting on the bench, and so often they would start crying and say, how did you know? That was exactly the story I needed to hear.
Really?
Stories would often be fighting over themselves, over which one to tell. And sometimes it could be stories that I'd never told before, that I'd forgotten completely because I'd read it maybe when I was 10 years old and I'd never thought of that story again until this precise moment. And that was precisely the story that needed to be told. There are
a little bit like also, I'm sorry to interrupt. So it's a little bit like reading that right book at the right time, or attending that performance or the art, exhibition that at the right time will be like a life changer. And you would say, I really needed to see this. I really needed to hear that. Or a movie or a film or a song, the lyrics of a song. I can see why stories would have that power. And I think there's another important factor is this human to human, right? So the film and the song and it's on a stage and you're the audience, whereas I think in storytelling it's closer, it's tighter, it's more tangible perhaps. Yeah. So what happened next?
I couldn't feel the story speaking to me anymore. And eventually, years passed in which I was working on something else, still something that I definitely enjoyed and that I was passionate about, because that's probably one of the things that I value most, or that has made the most difference in my life, was that from the beginning I always committed, the process has to be of equal value as the result. I'm never going to devote my life to somewhere I am miserable. I kept expecting the stories to come back, and they never did. And years went by. And finally, when COVID hit and the whole country locked down, I went to live in a cabin in the woods, in the forest by myself, because when everyone was talking about reinventing themselves, I finally admitted and realized, well, I can't just sit around waiting for the stories to come back. I have to do something.
You're in Colombia.
In Colombia, yes. I have to heal my soul or die trying, essentially, was my motto. And
alone in a forest?
I went
you could have died.
This.
Maybe.
Maybe. I mean, it wasn't really dangerous what I was doing, but I was going very, very deep inside myself. I discovered a type of meditation in which I simply was able to listen to stories within. And I realized that as a storyteller, I'd always told stories, but I'd never told my own. I never even asked to hear them. But finally being there away from the world with just myself for company and, no Wi-Fi or cell phone service for the first few months, I started asking to hear my own stories. And stories just started pouring out of a place that I didn't even know I had. It wasn't like imagination. It wasn't that I was making stories up. It was more from the dream world, where when you have a dream, you don't know what's coming next, even if you're aware that you're dreaming, and it can take you by surprise. And when I would do this as a meditation, stories would come up that I would say, I would never have been able to make this by myself. I don't know where this is coming from, but it was so meaningful to me. And I realized that even though I couldn't tell stories, I could still hear them. And as I listened to all these characters, these different parts of myself coming up as if they were a fairy tale, and seeing myself stepping out of my story, I was able to become my own storyteller. And the storyteller can change things. The storyteller can do whatever. If you're inside the story, you're at the mercy of it. You're stuck. And you just go down wherever the storyteller decides you go. But if you step outside of the story, of the pattern that you're living in, then you say, okay, I don't like this. I'm going to change this character. I'm going to pull these strings.
And this is true for our own stories as well?
I believe so. I started, because it was so mind-blowing to me, I started telling some friends, hey, do you want to try this? It's really cool. And so far, it has always had really incredible results. Later, learned that this type of dreaming while you're awake is, as some people call, shamanic journeying, and that it's something that's practiced by many different cultures. And there are many ways to access this non-ordinary reality. It's something that feels very real, even if it's only happening in your mind. You can access that through sacred plant medicines like ayahuasca, for instance, that can induce a vision, or through breath work or certain types of dance. I found that the easiest way is to simply ask. Just ask a question and follow the story. Follow whatever comes up, whether it's a thought, a feeling, a color, an image, a memory, anything, and then go down that rabbit hole and let the story unfold and see what happens. As I listened to my own stories, then I started dreaming about the stories that I had lost, stories that I hadn't told in years.
They started talking to you again.
Yeah, they started speaking to me again. And I planted seeds throughout the months, almost a year in that cabin. And by the time I left the cabin, I hadn't accomplished any of the spiritual goals that I had set out to do. But I realized that I had made so much progress that it was time to go back out into the world. And then opportunities started coming up to become the traveling storyteller again. Those seeds started bearing fruit.
So is this happening? Like how many years ago?
2020 was when I went to the cabin.
Right.
2021 was when I went out.
Yeah.
And then early 22 was when I started traveling again. And here I am.
So traveling through Europe, and
I was invited to perform at a storytelling festival in Morocco in February of 2022. And I thought, well, it's been a long time since I traveled, and it's been a long time since I told stories, and it feels like it's time to try again. I'd never been to Morocco before. I really wanted to travel. There was no point in staying in Colombia at the time because of COVID, there wasn't any work in tourism, which was what I was doing.
Right.
And so I thought, well, if I go all the way to Morocco, no sense in turning right around and coming back in 2 weeks. I might as well travel for a few months, 6 months, maybe a year. I didn't want to go alone. I invited a friend to come with me. We ended up falling in love along the way and decided to just keep going.
Like Marina and Marino.
Yeah. And
it's very nice.
Ironically, our names were also similar. There are a bunch of countries that we both want to visit. Both of us love travel, and we also realize if we don't do it now, we might not ever. Especially the way we travel, which is very low budget, hitchhiking, couch surfing, sometimes sleeping outside if we don't find a host, and really being open to what the road provides and to really connecting with the people. So it's not a vacation where we, go on a tour and stay in hotels. We're really getting into the culture that way. Often along the way, I'll tell stories too.
Do you pick stories up on the way?
Yeah, very often.
Yeah.
It's not the focus of the trip. I'm not on a research collecting trip, but I'm always on the lookout for stories. I'm always listening. Wherever I meet people, I ask them, can you tell me a story about your home or about something that you remember? What are some of the stories? Specifically, I'm interested in the stories that are still alive, the stories that people still believe in.
So Northern Ireland, Scotland, these places, when you said Europe, have you been in those areas?
Yes.
Wow. That's a place that's an area, a whole area that I'm fascinated by these past years.
You'll find a lot of people who believe in fairies.
Yeah.
Who've seen them there.
Yeah. Before we conclude our conversation, I was wondering if there was a story that you may have picked up or a story that you particularly like or like to tell or makes an impact. Because I think we like to tell the stories that we like. In my experience, I'm always telling a story that culminates in like a takeaway lesson. I don't know if that's your approach in general, or if you can tell us a story and tell us what is the purpose of that story and why do you like to tell it?
I only tell stories that I like, but I also understand that what I gain from a story will probably be different than
Sure.
what you get from it. Everybody can hear the same story and it can speak to people in different ways. And a story can only break your heart if your heart is already broken. One of the great master storytellers that I've met along the trip said once that people would come up to her all the time and say, "But why am I crying? This didn't happen to me." And she would answer, "Of course it happened to you. That's why you're crying." That's the beauty of symbolic language, which is what art in its so many different forms uses, because it can speak to people according to what they need at the moment. I have a story that I feel fits in Armenia.
Mm-hmm.
It fits in many different places, but though Colombia and Armenia have very, very different experiences, we both have that sensation of yearning for peace and of not even perhaps knowing what that's like. And this is a very ancient story. It is an indigenous tale that comes from the Yuracare people in what is now Bolivia. I say creek, you say crack.
Yes.
Creek,
Crack.
creek,
Crack.
creek, crack. If you go all the way to the Amazon, the Manigua, that great mother of jungles, and you go deep, deep, deep into the jungle, all the way towards where the sun sets, although you only have a vague idea because the canopy of trees can block it out. If you go deep, 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 you'll pass the Yuracare people with the fragrant fruit trees and the canoes of the fish. And if you go further still, past the edge of the world, there lives Sararuma. Sararuma cannot die, and so he loves to kill the things that can. And he almost once destroyed the world. Almost. If Sararuma had set the entire world on fire, the world would have been saved, because the people would have come together to put out the blaze. But no. Sararuma understands us too well. And so Sararuma set fire to only half of the fruit trees, the ones on this side of the river. And as the people were running with their calabashes and gourds filled with river water to put out the flames, Sararuma appeared in his billowing red cloak and pointed to the other side where their friends and neighbors were watching in horror. "Look," he said, "they have always been jealous of you. They were the ones who wished to destroy you. They were the ones who set fire to your fruit trees and your gardens and your homes. Quickly, destroy them before they take everything you have." And consumed by rage, people dropped their calabashes of water and broke off flaming branches from the trees and jumped into their canoes. And soon the entire world was ablaze. Only 2 people survived. 1 man, 1 woman. They had each, from their different sides of the river, begged their leaders to make peace. They had spoken out to their friends and family, and they had tried to reason. The rest of them who were on their side, the people who they were able to convince, one by one, they were either killed or taken. And finally, hatred was too great. They realized that they had done everything they could, and there was nothing more they could do. And if they stayed, they too would be consumed. And so the most heartbreaking decision of their lives, they had to flee. And as they ran, trying to ignore the shouts coming behind them from their friends and family of, "Coward! Coward! Come back here and help us fight!" They knew that the fight was a lost cause. and they ran. They ran from the flames and the smoke and the screams of the dying. They ran searching for peace, but they did not find it because there was no peace anywhere. All they could find was a hole. In the running and stumbling over the bodies and jumping over the flaming branches, in the fleeing of this, they found each other, and recognizing each other as the enemy, but also as a fellow human who was running away, they held hands until they were far enough, and they found the hole, and they crawled in, and they covered it up, and they waited in darkness, deep in the belly of the earth. And there is nothing harder, more maddening than waiting. Oh, regret ate at their mind, those rats in your head that tell you that you've done the wrong thing, that you should be back there fighting and dying alongside those you loved. How dare you leave everything, nothing but their own madness and each other for company, until finally the screams of the dying were silent. And they waited. Still they waited, knowing that it was too soon. But finally, after they felt enough time had passed, the man crawled out to the entrance of the hole. But he was smart. If you come out too soon, everything will be lost. And so, first, he held out a stick out into the world, and the stick burst into flames. Too soon, he said sadly, and crawled back down into the darkness. The next day, the woman crawled up and held out the stick. It burst into flames. Too soon, she said. 8 days passed until finally they held out the stick, and it came back cold, and so they crawled out of the hole, blinking in the blinding sun that they were seeing for the first time. Where was the canopy of fragrant fruit trees? Where was the great Manigua jungle? And as they stepped outside, ashes everywhere. There was nothing left, not even the river. There was so much ash that it blanketed the river, and all around them was a wasteland of ash lying in the wind. And they fell to their knees in despair, and great heaving sobs rose up, and they just looked at each other brokenly with no hope at all. And their sobs drew the attention of Sararoma, who thought that he had wiped the world clean. And he appeared before them in his billowing cloak. Ha! You have survived? And at first rage billowed up within him, but then he began to laugh. Ha 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 ha. You have survived, he said, but for what? Look all around you. The world is destroyed, and I will watch you destroy each other. Because you see, Sararoma cannot kill directly. He has to have us do it for him. I will watch you destroy each other, because you too, do you not recognize her markings? Do you not see who he is? Ha! It was your people who caused this. You will tear each other to pieces, because it was her family who killed your friends. It was his people who destroyed your village. I will just sit here and watch you die. And that was when their hopelessness, their despair, turned to defiance. No, said the man, and he stood up straight and tall, and he stared at Sararoma with hatred in his eyes, because hatred and rage can feed defiance, and that is sometimes what you need. No, said the man, we will not destroy each other. We will make our own peace. Sararoma became a bit smaller. What do you mean you will make your own peace? That is not even possible. What? You think you will fall in love? You think you will marry? There are always problems in love. No couples always have fights. Then, said the woman, also standing up and taking the man's hand, then we will talk things through. Sararuma became even smaller. But you are alone, he screamed. There is nothing left, nothing. We will have children, said the woman. Sararuma became even smaller. But what are you going to do? Everything has been destroyed. But as he said it, the man looked up into the sky. The rains will come, he said. The forest will grow again. Sararuma became even smaller as the sound of thunder was heard in the distance, and the great rolling heavy clouds started coming in, attracted by the scent of smoke, and the ashes began to move. And the people, the man and the woman looked around and said, and we will not be alone, for we were not the only ones. And little noses started poking up out of the ashes, and little animals started crawling out. Animals who are wiser than we are, the animals who long since had fled and hidden themselves, waiting for the right time. They started crawling up out of the ash and gathering at the man and the woman's feet. And Sararuma, seeing them, became even smaller. But there is nothing left. The world is destroyed. Then, said the woman, as she bent down and pushed aside the ash and held something up in her hands, then, she said, we will begin again. And in her hands, there was a seed.
That was a wonderful story. Really timely. I think so many people need to hear that story right now. You touched on Armenia and Colombia. I think those two countries definitely need to find the road to peace. But not only Armenia and Colombia. There's just too much happening in the world, and I think these kinds of stories will help people realize how much we as humans are more alike and really need each other more than we are different. We are the ones who are destroying each other, basically, with the hate and anger and rage. Thank you for that fantastic story. The title of our podcast is Coffee Spills and Pineapples. So let me conclude with this question that I ask all our guests. Coffee spills. Any coffee spills that happened, like things that didn't go your way, mistakes that happened, a huge blunder, a major gaffe that you want to share with us? And consequently, what's your pineapple? What's the crown jewel of your success or your happy point? So, coffee spills?
One thing, when I was doing my solo trip through Europe, towards the beginning of my trip, I was expecting that I was going to have the same success with telling stories on the street like I did in Latin America. I spent some time in Spain and thought, okay, because of the language, everything will be fine. But it didn't really work. People were very closed. And so I was dreading going out. Sometimes I would even encounter hostility and rudeness, which had never been my experience. And so I was realizing I was becoming lazy. I was not doing a lot of storytelling, and the focus of my trip was storytelling that time.
Were you able to overcome? I mean, were you able to eventually find a place where you would tell the stories and people were receptive?
Well, I found myself forced to tell stories because my computer and all my savings were stolen. So that trip was different from the Central American one. The Central American one, I was broke. The one with Europe, I had enough money, and then suddenly I didn't.
Wow.
And so I was like, okay, well, at least I've been here, been there, done that. I know what to do. I'm going to have to make money on the way. But if approaching random strangers on the street isn't working, how do I have to adapt? Because it's never the audience's fault. If the audience isn't responding, then you as an artist are doing something wrong. You have to reach them the way they need to be reached. So I just started trying lots of different things to see what would work. I tried being a living statue with the sign saying that I would come to life and tell a story if you gave money. I tried having a flag that said traveling storyteller from Colombia, and just wandering around with the flag. And if I saw somebody staring at the flag and saying, then I was like, aha, and then I would go over to them. What worked best in Spain was that Spain has a fantastic culture of artsy cafes and bars, and so I would talk to the owners and say, can I go table to table telling stories?
Oh, okay.
And more often than not, they would say yes. And their people were very receptive. And it was really interesting. And it also gave added value to the cafe because it was this unique experience that people were having.
How funny, because on the street, they're the same people on the street and in the cafe. It's culturally that made more sense to be in a cafe area. Maybe sleep.
They felt safe.
Yeah, okay.
So they knew that if I was in there, that meant I had permission to be in there.
Yeah.
And that it was going to somehow fit the ethos or the idea of the venue that they were in.
I like what you said about, I think that's something that I'll take with me, is it's not the audience's fault.
No.
The artist has to review what they're doing wrong and re-deliver. Okay, and pineapple.
Pineapple, that means good things, things that I'm happy about.
Yeah. So it looks like a crown. It's like the beautiful fruit. It tastes so
fantastic.
good.
It's pineapple from Colombia.
Yeah.
So there's just been so many, like
My more recent one, perhaps. Yeah.
so full.
That's great.
One thing is that I've vowed to never devote myself to something that makes me unhappy. So I've never done a job just for the money because I know that that's not good enough. It could get stolen at any time and then you would have nothing. Not only would you not have the end result of the money, but you would also have lost the time that you invested in doing that job. So everything I met when I was hitchhiking through Colombia years ago, towards the beginning of my traveling days, I was picked up by a truck driver. And I asked him, if you could do anything in your life, what would you do? And without even hesitating, he said, this.
Wow.
And he told me a story. He had actually been an engineer. He had had a 9-to-5 job. He had made a lot more money than a truck driver does. And he hated it. Ever since he was a little boy, he loved to play with toy trucks. And finally, he quit everything. He bought himself his truck and he spent his life driving up and down the wild, lonely, beautiful roads of Colombia and picking up the odd hitchhiker every once in a while. And I said, I want to live that way. I want to live in such a way that any moment, if somebody asked me, if you could be doing anything, what would you be doing? I would say this. If you could be anywhere, here. If you could be with anyone, with you. And living that way has brought me so much magic. Like my partner, who is the most amazing person, who is the greatest gift in my life right now. And the magic of the road, of finding the right story for the right person at the right time, which doesn't always happen, but when it does, I feel it's life-changing for both of us.
That was great. Thank you so much. Thanks for being with us today. Really wonderful talking to you about storytelling, the inspirational stories, the path that you've taken, and I wish you an amazing journey ahead. Can't wait to hear more about your stories and see where you head out. You do have a website or our socials, or how do we follow you?
Yes, we have social media. I don't post very often.
Well, we can have it here. You can see it below. So tell us what it is.
Okay, my website is www.achira, Achira, achirastories.com. And there you'll also be able to see the map of the places we've been, and you'll see where we're located in the moment, so you can follow the journey.
That's wonderful. And people can get in touch. Are you receptive to that?
Yes, of course. Everyone, feel free to reach out to me. You can find me on Instagram.
Invite Juliana to tell her stories to you.
Of course.
I wish you an amazing journey ahead. Tell the stories that you love. Make the difference. Heal the people that listen to you and let them heal themselves. Thank you for the time. Thank you for being our guest today. Looking forward to reading more about your experiences, your adventures, and maybe listening to more stories in the years to come. Stay in touch.
Of course.
Thank you so much for being with us. Have a good day.